want to tell you a story about a guy called Bob Coy, and you might never have heard of him before. He was a guy who worked in the music industry in Detroit in the 1970s, and he lived a wild life of drugs and sex and rock and roll. But then he encountered Jesus, and his life was completely transformed, completely turned around. He cleaned himself up. He became a pastor, and he planted a church. And he started meeting in a part of a funeral parlor. They gave him some space, and he started meeting there. The church started to grow, and then it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And after 2 decades, they had 25,000 people in this church. It was Florida's biggest megachurch. And American presidents came down to sort of visit it. He obviously, inevitably became a sort of TV and radio superstar. But suddenly, in April 2014, he walked away from his church. He admitted to multiple affairs and a pornography addiction. He walked away from his ministry, sold his house, and divorced his wife. And you might not have heard of Bob Coy, but you will have heard of a number of other church leaders, or at least maybe some of them. Ted Haggard, Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, Pete Wilson, Mark Driscoll, Mark Bailey, even Bill Hybels, and many, many, many more. And all of these high-profile leaders, both in this country and America, they were those whose ministries and leadership suffered. Some of them even collapsed because of a crisis, some sort of moral crisis, because of a hidden fault line, as it were, in their personality, something in the dark side of their leadership. And this is a strange principle to have in Cultivate. It's one of the only one of the 25 Cultivate principles that most of the information is not my own. It is one that I've really had to kind of research and read up about. In fact, most of the content from this principle comes from a great book that I'd recommend you read called The Dark Side of Leadership by 2 guys called Gary McIntosh and Samuel Rimmer. But I knew this principle had to be in Cultivate. We had to look at this before we ended. I knew it was something that was going to impact all of us. Because let me tell you this, every leader has a dark side. Every single one. You do, I do. Every leader suffers from some degree of personal dysfunction, either fairly mild to the very acute, which normally makes the sort of headlines. You and I might not have the same issues or dysfunction as those leaders that we spoke about earlier, but we all have something. And most leaders are not aware of their dark side or their personal dysfunction, and because most of it goes easily disguised in the church, dysfunctions that drive Christian leaders often go unseen and unchallenged until often it's too late. And so in this extended principle, we're going to break our rules of Cultivate and go longer. What we want to do is look at the dark side of leadership, what it is, how it develops, what are the typical 5 descriptions of the dark side of leadership, and what are we going to do about it. And this could take much more time than we have got. But we just want to raise the issue and start the whole conversation. You will need to continue this with others outside, beyond this, that you know and trust. And so what is the dark side? What is it? And those people who have studied this tell us that the dark side of a person, of a leader, is actually a result of human development. It is the inner urges and compulsions and dysfunctions of a personality that often go unexamined or remain unknown to us until we hit some kind of pressure or some sort of trial or crisis. And strangely enough, these things are not essentially negative, in fact, despite what the term suggests. In almost every case, factors that eventually undermine us are shadow sides of those things that actually contribute to our success. The dark side of leadership is something that we often confront suddenly, but it has been a lifetime in the making for us. And if we are not careful, if it is not acknowledged or redeemed, it can explode with great ferocity. And there are multiple signs of the dark side: the drive to achieve, the profound need for approval, the irrational fear that your work is not adequate, the drive to overwork, the need for control, a tendency toward perfectionism, and any behavior that seems to overpower us, as well as any sort of urge or sort of motivation that seems to uncontrollably drive us. These are signs, these are indications, these are little red flags of the dark side of leadership within us. And we haven't got time, and I haven't got the expertise to tell you how the dark side develops, but I'll briefly try and explain some of it. Most of you will have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a pyramid of needs that all of us have to have met in our lives continually. And Maslow's main point is that our basic needs must be met before we can become motivated to achieve the higher needs. And these needs start with our physiological needs at the base of the triangle: food and drink and shelter. And then it moves on to safety needs, financial and personal, emotional safety. And then it moves on to love and belonging, and these are about friendships and intimacy and family. And then it moves on to esteem. And this is about a need for recognition and status and self-respect, self-importance. And then what psychologists call the final stage, self-actualization, which is about the sort of realization of our full potential, which is different for all of us. And we look to have those first needs met at the base of our triangle before we move on to our higher needs. And those who study these needs or these things say that if some of those needs aren't met, we end up with sort of missing kind of blocks, as it were, in our need pyramid that we will attempt to meet, often subconsciously. Or alternatively, we might encounter some traumatic event during our developmental years that causes us to feel permanently threatened in one of our need areas. And one type of this trauma, it's only one type, is what they call existential debt. And this is a belief that our unmet need is our fault. And we must somehow satisfy this. And this usually occurs as a result of a traumatic event. And one example of this, for instance, is when parents go through a divorce, their children often experience the failure of their parents' relationship as a personal failure. If I had been more obedient, if I had kept my room tidy, then, Dad, wouldn't have left us. And because that is not the cause, and they can never meet or, repay that debt, in many instances in their entire life, adult life, they'll be spent in an unconscious effort to repay that debt. And so unmet needs and traumatic events, this stuff is at the heart of how our dark side begins to develop. And when certain events threaten us in one of our need areas, or we are deprived in any way, we should expect that meeting that need can become a controlling element of our personality. That's just the way we work. But let me say this: they don't have to shipwreck our lives. It is not inevitable that these past events shipwreck our lives. If threatening events and unmet needs are acknowledged and dealt with openly, meeting these needs can be a healthy process. But if meeting these needs is seen as a sign of weakness or personal failure, or even if we're just unaware of how we meet those needs, then this is often the beginning of the formation of our dark side. And there will be some listening to this, and many leaders out there who are asking a very sort of basic sort of question. Presuming that this so-called dark side exists, do we really need to overcome it? Why don't we just let it lie and sort of leave it? Do we need to go through this journey, which might be a difficult journey for sort of, some of us, of looking at this? But I can promise you this: your dark side will impact your leadership. It already has. It already has done. And you might not divorce your wife or husband or have multiple affairs or have some great big meltdown, but it will affect your journey. And this journey to redeem the dark side of our personalities and leadership starts with believing that we need to do it. A guy called Warren Bennis once said that experiences in our past do not merely rule us, they inhibit us and make fools of us. This journey to redeem the dark side of our personalities and leadership starts with believing that you need to do it. Can I urge you, face up to your dark side now because you choose to, before you do it because you have to. And those who study this stuff have come up with 5 typical leaders, 5 typical dark sides of leadership that sort of emerge because of unmet needs and traumatic events. And in our sessions, we briefly describe what these 5 leadership types are, but we also go through something which is not easy for everybody and challenging, and that is we actually go through a self-analysis, a brief kind of reflection on each one that's meant to show us if we have an inclination toward one of these 5 or more than one. It is not comprehensive. It is something that just begins that journey of self-awareness and hopefully leading toward wholeness and healing. Okay, let's start with the first type of leader. And even before we do these self-assessments, if you sort of do them, you might start to recognize yourself in some of these descriptions. And the first leader is a type of person that we would call a compulsive leader. This is a leader who has a need to maintain absolute order in the need to control things. They pursue perfection to an extreme, both in their sort of organizational life and in their personal life. These leaders develop very rigid, highly systematic daily routines. They tend to be very image conscious. They are deferential and even ingratiating towards superiors. They continually look for reassurance and approval from authority figures. They are anxious when they are unsure of their own performance and standing. And because of all these efforts, take a lot of energy to keep going. They are excessively devoted to their work. They are often workaholics, often to the detriment of their family. In these leaders, there's little room for spontaneity. They are often over-moralistic. They are conscientious. They are judgmental of themselves and of other people. And although they are a picture of kind of absolute order in terms of grooming and clothing and speech, environment, inside they are an emotional powder keg. At heart, they can be angry, rebellious individuals who believe it is wrong to express their sort of true feelings. And this can be the result of a rigid childhood when sort of unrealistic expectations were placed on them, or the product of some kind of childhood trauma to which they were not allowed to give appropriate expression. Whatever the source, these leaders, compulsive leaders, they sort of respond to their inner turmoil by so tightly binding their feelings that the opposite of turmoil results. They are highly controlled and they're highly ordered. That is why it's common for these sort of individuals to have repressed anger in them that comes out in sudden and violent outbursts, only to be just as quickly controlled again. That's our first type, the compulsive leader. Okay, let's look at the second type of leader, the type of leader that I struggle to say, and I won't be saying this word very often, the narcissistic leader. An ancient mythology tells us the story of a young boy called Narcissus, and I won't be saying that word very often either. And he was an extremely beautiful boy, and many of his peers were very attracted to him, but they couldn't get through to him because his focus, his gaze was elsewhere. And because when he was 16 years old, apparently he was walking alongside a river, and he stopped beside a sort of pool, a sort of very still pool, to have a drink of water. And as he leaned over for the first time in his life, he saw an image of himself, and he was transfixed by his own image. He fell in love with his own image. And as this as the story goes, he eventually could not bear to leave his own reflection. He lay down by that pool until he was absorbed by the earth, and he became a flower, which is called the narcissus, which can still be found by sort of pools, even now. And for this type of leader, the world revolves on the axis of self. They tend to be intensely ambitious. They have grandiose fantasies. They are over-dependent on external acclaim and admiration. But at the same time, the self-absorbed leader is chronically uncertain of themselves. They experience real dissatisfaction with their own accomplishments, which they try to overcome by exploiting others in ways that will kind of elevate their own self-image. These leaders, they tend to overestimate their own achievements, and they refuse to recognize quality and values in others. They are notorious for being unable to sympathize with those in which they lead. The pastor or speaker who steps down from the stage or platform and is immediately consumed with how their sermon went shows classic symptoms of this type of leadership. That's our second type. Our third type of leader is the paranoid leader. And paranoid leaders are desperately afraid of anything or anyone, whether real or imagined, that they perceive to even have the slightest potential of undermining their leadership and stealing their limelight. They are characteristically suspicious and hostile. They are guarded in their relationship with other people, even their close associates, even family members. They are hypersensitive to the actions and reactions of those they lead. They are always fearful of potential rebellions. Because they are deeply insecure in their own abilities, paranoid leaders are pathologically jealous of other gifted people. And these leaders often overreact to even the mildest form of criticism. In addition, these leaders are constantly attaching subversive meanings and motives to even the most innocent of sort of actions of others. And because of this, they often create sort of rigid structures and systems of sort of control in their organizations to ensure that they've got a finger in every single pie and to limit the autonomy of other people. Fourth type of leader is the codependent leader. And unlike the other three different types we have identified, this does not fall into any one sort of category of recognized personality disorder. It's more of a sort of generic trait that is found in many different personality types. Codependency is most often associated with people living with others who are compulsively dependent on something, on drugs or alcohol or food, pornography, whatever. And an important kind of aspect of their codependency is this kind of social system that they develop around these relationships. And the codependent family acts in a way to counterbalance the socially unacceptable behavior of that dependent person. And this often results in sort of emotional repression that creates great stress for this codependent person. And this has implications for those who are reared in very rigid, oppressive religious environments. And they have unspoken or unwritten rules about what is acceptable to discuss and what is not. And another clear aspect of codependency is the tendency to react to things rather than initiate them. They react to the pain and problems and behavior of other people in an effort to balance the family system, even if it's a church family, to sort of cover up family problems, even if it's a church family, to maintain peace in their relationships. And a sort of common reaction of these type of leaders is that they appear extremely benevolent, always willing to take on another task, even to the point of being overextended. They worry obsessively about the feelings of other people, often to the point of becoming emotionally and physically ill. A common manifestation in them is a failure to confront and deal with inappropriate behavior in their church community. Another one is that they are unable to say no to the requests of people in an effort to keep everyone happy and gain approval. So that's our fourth type. And our fifth and final type of leader is the passive-aggressive leader. And these leaders have a tendency to sort of resist demands to perform things adequately. And this resistance is most often expressed through behaviors such as dawdling or stubbornness or forgetfulness or intentional inefficiency. And this a reluctance to actually perform usually stems from a fear of failure, or fear that success actually will breed higher expectations, which could lead to some form of failure in the future. And these passive-aggressive leaders, and we've probably all encountered these, are prone to short outbursts which express intense emotions such as sadness or frustration or anger. And most of their sort of aggressive acts or outbursts lie just within the bounds of acceptable behavior. And these outbursts are usually followed by some kind of short-lived period of sorrow or sort of repentance even. And these leaders are perennial complainers whose very presence in a team tends to really demoralize those that they lead or those with whom they interact. And though they do tasks that are expected of them, it is with little or no enthusiasm. And because they are often really compulsive or impulsive, their acquaintances and colleagues are often feel edgy, sitting on eggshells, waiting for that next outburst. And another tendency is to exhibit sort of impatience or irritability or even sort of fidgeting when things are not going their way, or when they become bored with how things are happening. It's not that these leaders are constantly angry or complaining, and they can even appear happy or compliant, satisfied with their job. But a pattern of erratic behavior, emotional behavior, is seen over a period of time. On occasion, they will even try and exert control through these use of short outbursts of anger or emotion. So these are the 5 typical leaders, and none of that sounds very good. These 5 typical dark sides of leaders that can emerge because of unmet needs and traumatic events. So how do we go about processing some of what we have learnt, or even working through some of those that we know we have an inclination towards? As I've mentioned a few times, this is just the beginning of a process of self-awareness, of understanding what we are like and what is inside us. It is not the end. How do we go about processing this stuff? It is vital that we start by understanding something, and I'll quote from these guys, McIntosh and Riemann. Here's what they say. Overcoming, and this is massively important, overcoming our dark side is not about running away from these less attractive aspects of our personality. It is not a process of somehow excising them from our life, but rather of integrating them wholly into our lives. A woman called Judy Canato wrote about something that she and others have called spiritual composting, and this is what she said. What the process of composting tells me is that there are parts of my personality that are not usable in their present form, but are nevertheless indispensable because they provide raw materials for personal growth. Composting teaches me that I am responsible for participating in this process by identifying what is in need of transformation, but putting my refuse, as it were, in a designated place and then waiting as transformation occurs. Composting asks me to trust that I will eventually bear witness to what only God can do. And as she has said, these parts of our personality are not particularly useful in their present form, but it doesn't mean they're not useful at all. They just must be redeemed and transformed first. In fact, they hold potential for our most effective ministry and leadership. As Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12:9, our weaknesses can usually be our greatest strengths. And so here are some kind of very brief possible steps in this vital process of spiritual composting that lady was talking about as we go through a process of embracing and redeeming our dark side. First stage. Firstly, you must admit that your dark side exists, and you must understand that shape that it has taken in your life. Denial is a key blockage in a healthy process of integrating your dark side. Leaders can often deny this dark side and blame their failures on other people or on circumstances rather than taking personal responsibility. Second step is to examine your past. And this is a task that is best done with somebody else, a wise and trusted advisor or even a counselor. It is not something that happens quickly or easily, but the purpose is to kind of to recall all those events that have shaped your life and left an indelible mark and are still affecting your personality and leadership. You will find that gaining freedom from the power of those events and that dark side will probably involve extending forgiveness to somebody. It might even be yourself. The third step towards overcoming our dark side is a massively important one, and that is to resist the poison of unrealistic expectations. Expectations are a two-edged sword that either move you to achieve or weigh you down in failure. And the unrealistic ones, they produce friction and pressure in your life that will eventually lead to some kind of burnout. A recent survey of church leaders that left the church found that the second highest reason was unrealistic and unbearable expectations, both internal ones we put on ourselves, and external ones, those others put on us. Fourth step in this process of spiritual composting, of working through and understanding and ultimately embracing our dark side, is to begin to fully and deeply understand your identity in Christ. Your true value does not reside in your performance, in your position, in your titles, your achievement, your power. It exists independently of anything else you have done or will do. We know this in our heads, but unless this filters down into our hearts, we are going to be in trouble. Your greatest source of worth is being known by God and being declared righteous in Jesus Christ. Your value does not depend on your condition on earth, but it depends on your position in heaven. We know this stuff. We know it in our heads, but until we know it in our hearts, until it becomes our conviction of our lives, our dark side will continue to wage war against us. Fifth step toward overcoming our dark side is to start to practically do a range of things to start to practice the discipline of self-knowledge, being open and vulnerable to our own self. And this includes a whole range of vital spiritual disciplines we will only briefly mention. Scripture reading, not just prepping for talks, but using it as a mirror, allowing God's Spirit to speak into our lives and hearts. Personal a retreat, stepping away from the kind of busyness of ministry and leadership to reflect on our own kind of spiritual condition. Journaling, putting oneself life on paper, on video, asking, who am I? What am I doing? How do I feel about my life, my world? Accountability groups, submitting ourselves willingly, openly to ongoing, rigorous accountability. My time is up. We have already extended this principle far beyond the scope of others, and I hope you will sort of forgive me for that. I'll just say this as I end. The constant flow of failures amongst Christian leaders in every church denomination threatens the fabric of the church of Jesus. Our credibility as leaders and as a church is being eroded amongst those who we are called to and those who we lead. And these failures are caused by the dark side of our leadership, by these fault lines in our personalities that lead to personal crisis. They limit the power of our ministries. They cause us distress and anxiety. They rob us of our peace, and they definitely reduce our full potential. God desires you to be a fully effective, powerful, fruitful leader in his kingdom. He wants you to understand your dark side, to examine it, to bring it into the light, pray into it, and then ultimately embrace it as part of yourself.